So good afternoon, everyone. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you today at the ETH for these amazing panels on art and artificial intelligence. I'm Charlotte Stotzingen, director of the Zurich Art Weekend. And we came together with Adrian Knott, who is responsible for the arts at the AI Center. So shortly on our initiative, Zurich Art Weekend has been founded in 2018 with the aim to promote the absolutely amazing art scene here in Zurich and enable, democratize the access to the arts by enabling the public to have access to the exhibitions in more than 60 venues, so from museums and art centers to gallery of space, but also universities and collections and foundations in Zurich and around. And also, and most importantly, give access to the people, enable encounters with artists, with curators, with institution directors, with collectors, and all the people who basically are kind of like thinkers and enable this, the creation and creativity to be expressed. In this same line, we started also in 2018 to do cross-disciplinary exchange. As we truly believe that the art and its impact has a positive impact on us and on society by enabling us basically to think differently on oneself and to grow our understanding of oneself and of the world. So this talk is in line with what we have engaged to do since 2018, and yes, and it's I would say like a start for this year, 2022. You might wonder, because we are not at the normal date of Zurich Art Weekend. It's a weekend which always happened in June, before at Basel. But this year, so we started to have 2 more weekends in the year, so one in March and one in November. And this first talk is the start of like a bigger program that will be rolled out in June. And yeah, so next to the amazing quality of the art scene in Zurich, we also have amazing thinkers, like in the science or artificial intelligence and other area. And for us, it was also very important from the start to bring that out. And I'm glad we're here today. And I pass on the word now to Adrian Knott, who will give you an introduction to the talk today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Welcome to the Dozentenfoyer here at the top of the ETH Hauptgebäude, and welcome to our AI and art talk. I won't give a big introduction. Just want to say thank you, first of all, to Charlotte and to Holly and to Caroline and to Julie, who from the Zurich Art Weekend, who helped a lot in the background to organize this event over here. I also want to thank Oliver from the Dozentenfoyer, who's set up this beautiful place over here for you tonight. And Tashi, who will be filming everything, so we will have it far long into the future for the world to see this great event here. I'm very happy and also very honored to have our podium here with Roland Fisher. He is I have to read it, sorry. He will be moderating. He's an interdisciplinary scientist, a science and art writer, curator, and art science catalyst. And during the pandemic, he also opened the artist-run space, Symbiont Space, in Basel. You will find the biographies of the speakers in the program that is on the chair, and Roland will also give them small introductions to our talkers. I want to thank Sabine Himmelsbach, director of the HEK, the Haus der Elektronischen Künste, for bringing this important institution from Basel to Zurich in her person, so to say. I want to also thank Alex Ilich. He's my boss, the executive director of the ETH AI Center. And in that sense, I also thank him that he had the courage to invite me and Nora to start this AI and art program here at the AI Center. And then last but not least, I want to thank Nora a lot. It is actually thanks to her and her artistic work that we have this initiative here in the ETH AI Center. It's, well, yeah, they saw your work and they thought it could be interesting, so that's the truth. And together we are trying to establish an AI and art initiative or program, which is basically built on 3 pillars. The first one is on an educational level. We want to make collaborations with art universities and the ETH. We'll have a seminar in 2 weeks where we will ask the question, what kind of AI do we want to bachelor students of fine arts and of computer science? So it will also be interesting to see how they can work together and communicate together. We want to establish a fellowship program for emerging artists, preferably from beyond Europe. So artists that are not like Nora, not so established already in the AI and art context. And of course, we also want to do a lot of artistic projects and nice talks, like hopefully tonight. And in this sense, I wish you a good evening, and I hand over the mic to Roland.
Welcome, everybody, to that beautiful space up here. It's a big pleasure to host this evening. It's a very personal pleasure to be here, actually, because I used to be a student at ETH, and obviously I was never allowed to come up here. So I made my way up to top floor in a bit of a through the back doors, I guess. Since I've been studying here, I've always been fascinated with kind of the backstories of science and engineering. I want to stress that. This is maybe much more an engineering school than a university, right? And engineers kind of have a bit of a renaissance these days. They used to be big in Switzerland. I mean, they always were big, right? But at the big times of the engineer in Switzerland was the 19th century. And now we're kind of seeing a big time of engineers again, and we probably will talk about this as well. This is all going to be about the role of the artist when it comes to technology. It's all about creative potentials. It's all about imaginations, but it's also about power structures. I want to stress that. Just a little number to start off with. I've read some months ago that just now 80% of all data scientists, of all AI specialists are working for the big 5. So we're seeing a monopolization of brain power, and maybe this is kind of an interesting thing to talk about as well. So let's start off with one of the other 20%, right? Alex Ilich, he's a data scientist himself. He's been doing all kinds of interesting stuff. I'll not read all through it. I'll just stress that as a specialist in AI, he's seen both sides. He's been very active in the academic side of AI, researching AI, but he's also a very successful entrepreneur. Founded some legendary AI companies and is now responsible for the AI Center at ETH, which you'll be talking about in a small presentation.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I see a little bit my job in making it possible that we can actually experiment quite a lot and bring a lot of people together. I'm amazed that so many of you are here. I would be curious, just like a quick poll in the beginning, like who of you sees yourself more on the art side, who have more on the science side? Maybe let's and then undefined, yeah. So I don't know if we divided it in the middle, but who sees themselves on more on the art side of things?
Oh wow!
Okay, cool. Then a raise of hands on the science side. Okay, cool, very good. And undefined or both? Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay, so why I'm asking this is also because I think, like, if you saw other people that raised their hands when you were not, you should talk to these people, because I think this is exactly, you know, a combination that we want to facilitate. Let me talk a little bit about AI, and then also, you know, why are we doing what we're doing right now? So first of all, everyone knows artificial intelligence advances quite a lot. You've seen it in, you know, humans playing games versus AIs, where AIs are getting better and better. You see machine translation, you see autonomous driving, you see a number of breakthroughs in various disciplines. For instance, biology, health, and so on coming up. Also, example, for instance, for protein folding, where DeepMind made a significant contribution, robotic, and so on. So it's a huge topic, and it's very clear that it's not just transforming one industry, but basically all of the industries, all of the aspects of our lives. The question is, you know, are we early? Are we late? Is always like a question that comes in. I personally believe we're very early. It's amazing to see what progress has been happening the last 10 years, but we're still very early, and I hope I can show that in a few points. So the AI Center was founded October 2020. So we're not really old from that term. However, research in AI has been going on at ETH for decades. So that's very important. So what's different now is basically that while the position was already very strong, it was a little bit fragmented. You know, at ETH we have 16 departments: computer science, mathematics, but also what people don't know, for instance, also social sciences, health, and so on. And actually, the most popular lecture at whole ETH is actually the introduction in machine learning. So it's also a very strong signal that we received from students that in all of the areas there's a demand from the young generation coming in. And this is why with the center we're trying to address this, that we say, how can we bring people together? And what we see is a big blocker is basically that people want trustworthy AI systems. You want that the systems are basically doing something positive. So the purpose that basically drives me and also drives the center is that we see AI as a tool that ultimately amplifies the human potential and not diminishes it. And the question is, what can you do to implement it? And that one of the key parts that we want to enable here is bringing people together in a very interdisciplinary way. And also what's maybe a little bit funny, that we also like a lot of random things happening. So we like serendipitous collaboration. So we like to create an environment where people randomly meet, start something together, because this is usually the ingredients for the next breakthrough research, that people get inspired by something they have not seen before. And with this, maybe you already know that this is the point where it was very clear we need art also in the picture, and not just to basically have something to look at, which is nice, but the way of thinking, and also very important as a way of bringing back that inner dialogue. So I see it as a success if we're also very successful in basically bringing the different ways of thinking together, not just critically and communicating, but also changing that forward. So we're not the first AI center in the world, but maybe one thing that is close to our heart is that we want to focus on bringing researchers together that work on new AI foundations. We can, if you're interested, later talk a little bit what is still missing on foundations and how early we are. But one simple example is the amount of data you need today to train models, and then what they can do at the end is actually still very inefficient compared to, for instance, human learning, where you instantly pick up new things and so on, right? So we're early on the foundational level. Then the applications, this is where the methods are being used. So they can be all across various fields. But we also look at the implications, ethical considerations, trust in systems, explainability are all important things that we bring in. So with a central hub for AI at ETH, as I mentioned, interdisciplinarity is very important, and the co-evolution of AI foundations and impact areas. And it sounds very simple, but it's actually very hard to do. So one thing that we had already in the beginning is that we also have a physical center. So almost 1,000 square meters. Why? Because we want people that they go outside of their normal comfort zone, because then you're much more likely to be open to collaborate with others. So we deliberately built models where you physically collide, so to say, with other disciplines and lines of thought. We have a flagship fellowship program. I will show a little bit about this, which is already successfully running. And hopefully, thanks to Nora and Adrian, we can bring the same on the art level as well. And last but not least, we care that we not just do the research and advance the field there, but also how can we accelerate the time that it gets faster from science to society through startups, through innovative companies, and so on. So how large is the AI Center? So currently we're 110 professors. So that's really huge. It's one of the largest AI centers in the world. Connected to the professors are over 1,500 researchers, which is quite amazing. Not everyone is, of course, on an equal level as deep in AI, but this is something which we see growing and growing over time. But it's covering all 16 departments, and we have even included professors from University of Zurich and one professor from University of St. Gallen. Why? Because ETH has very close collaborations. For instance, we also want in the medical field, the link to the Unispital is very important for advancing that field too. This is just, I don't go too much into detail, but just a visual map that you see. We're active in a number of areas from sustainability to manufacturing and so on that are important for society. And we see it really as as basically a feedback loop that both things, foundations and application areas, evolve together. And in the foundational area, there's also a lot of interdisciplinarity happen, for instance, from neuroscience combined with people on machine learning foundations. Good. And last but not least, the fellowship program. So just very simple, we assign basically, so we're in the business of attracting a lot of top talent. So this year we got 610 applications. We're picking 10 PhD fellows, so 10 out of 600 is extremely selective. But when we started, we didn't know that there's such a high demand because we ask for people that are the bridge builders in themselves. So we look, for instance, a person that is an expert in machine learning and also in the health field. And we set them up basically with the best professors in two areas. So this is the concept that we drive there. And this is basically our direct contribution to bringing that together. And here are a few examples of that. So it can be really on foundational topics, but it can be also on topics like, for instance, AI and learning sciences. We're basically a professor from the social sciences department. So Manu Kapoor, for instance, working a lot on productive failure and learning methods on how we can learn faster, combined it with computer science, or perception-based control. So how can we interact more with robots more dynamically, or last but not least, causality in health, which is also very important for many of the applications, not just what we see thanks to COVID. So we have that running. These are the fellows that joined last year. We have a new batch joining basically in September this year. And what we would love to do is find something similar. Find people that speak the language from the art side and the technology side that we can have bridge builders. And again, a focus on the new young generation and emerging artists. Why? Because we think these are the ones that are really hungry to drive change, and we should really enable them and give them, everything they need, that they don't need a lot of courage to change the world in a positive way. Good. Thanks a lot. I hope that gave a little bit of a introduction on why we're doing what we're doing with this.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's already 5:30. That was the timing for the discussion. But we're giving two more presentations about because we need to hear more about what you're actually doing and why you're doing what you're doing. First with Sabine Himmelsbach. That's a long CV as well. I'll keep it very short. She's director of Haus für Elektronische Künste, House of Electronic Arts in Basel. You might know that museum. If you don't, you should. This is the place where digital arts is been reflected most thoroughly, I'd say, in Switzerland. It's a small museum, but it's an important one. And it's just been honored I'd say, to be part of the European Capital of Culture in Esch, in Luxembourg, where Sabine and her team are mounting an exhibition along with, and these names might be more familiar, along with TechOM in Karlsruhe and Ars Electronica. So you're kind of the small player within this media arts field in Europe, but an important one.
Thank you, Roland, and thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I'm speaking today from my perspective as director and curator, and I brought some examples of AI-based exhibitions that we staged at HEC, House of Electronic Arts in Basel. First show we did in 2019, titled Entangled Realities, and I have to say since then there has been no exhibition where we did not have a work of AI in the show, be it using explicitly AI for the artistic process or reflecting on the input of AI on society. I would like to start with a brief insight into the institution that I run. HEC is a multidisciplinary museum showcasing art that is using media technologies or reflecting on the input of these technologies on society at large or on us. I have here two examples of a solo show. It's outstanding artistic practice. Quite interesting show by Lawrence Leck, who actually projected HEC into the future in a Gesamtkunstwerk, a museum run by an AI. Or here an exhibition that was dealing with emotion and technology, and here also facial recognition systems and AI was important. Apart from that, we are also showcasing electronic music, interactive performances. An important part of our work is also the educational activities, and here a focus on hardware and software skills. And last but not least, we are also building a collection, and here the focus lies on software and net-based artistic practice. You can imagine also quite demanding, as these are not stable projects that can be easily kept for future generations. But now to the topic of today, AI and art. The artistic engagement with machines and the outsourcing of artistic creation to a machine has a long art historical tradition, starting with the machine dreams of the futurists at the beginning of the 20th century, early computer graphics of the 1960s, up to the current use of AI. And an early example is the Aron computer system developed by Harold Cohen in the 1970s. He was interested in the creative capabilities of such a system and saw it as a collaborator for his artistic practice. And here you see Cohen coloring the shapes and forms that the algorithmic system has created. In recent years, there has been a hype about art created with AI. You might remember the auction of the work Portrait of Edward de Bellamy by the French artist group Obvious in 2018 by Christie's for about 430,000 US, a result that was almost 45 times higher than the estimated value. Artists are fascinated by the possibilities of AI to create surprising visual output and unheard sounds. Musician Holly Herndon has trained an AI that is part of her musical ensemble. AI pioneer Mario Klingemann, that you see here, let his AI create uncanny images that explore the latent space of computational image production. In Uncanny Mirror, a piece that we showed in the Entangled Realities exhibition, we encounter our own image in real time, seen by an AI that has been trained to recognize human faces. In the same exhibition, we also wanted to make curatorial use of AI and asked the artist group Fabric CH to train an AI to develop the scenography of our exhibition. For this experiment, we gave some practical information about the wall systems, for example, how many we have and so on. And the result was quite surprising. Here you see one of the renderings that the algorithms made, and here you see the actual exhibition space. So the algorithm broke everything down into individual parts and fragments. Wall color was really used very erratically as well. For us, this was an inspiration. We did not use the system that the AI generated, but we were inspired to really make a very dynamic setup for the exhibition. So this working together really was the trick here. Apart from surprising visual outputs, artists also addressed the wider socio-political and ethical dimensions of machine vision. And I would also like to show two examples. In Vibe Check by American artists Lauren Lee McCarthy and Kyle McDonald, visitors' emotional response to others was monitored and judged by a machine learning system, which of course also showed the limitations of facial recognition systems. In Co-AI Existence, artist Justine Aymar addresses questions of coexistence of humans and machines. In her poetic work, we see a dancer interacting with the robot altar that is developed by the Ishiguro Labs in Japan and interact with each other in a pas de deux, you could say. And my last two examples are from our current show, where Swiss artist Mark Lee critically reflects upon the use of AI to analyze profile data and create personalized advertisements and the belief in techno-fixes to environmental problems. In France, we are confronted with AI-generated faces that make us think about the protection of personal data. And in Yanto, we see a speculative future with an ocean inhabited by an AI-enhanced flora and fauna that may survive contaminated environments. But can we really compare our ecosystem to a technological system? The examples showcase how artists are using AI as a tool for their artistic palette, but also that they are critically reflecting the impact of these technologies. In the best sense, they provide us with new perspectives. They make us aware of the limits of objectivity of these automatic systems because an algorithm follows a set of rules and is based on pattern recognition processes. They problematize the categorization of deeply personal and delicate matters such as human emotions. Art raises our sensibility to interrogate who funds, trains, and owns our algorithms. It helps us open up to our human sensorium to other forms of intelligence and perception to recognize our entanglement with creatures and machines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. You gave us quite a lot to think and to talk about. We'll take that up for sure. I highly recommend that exhibition, the current one you mentioned, which is on until?
Until the 24th of April.
Yes, go and see that best of Swiss media arts from today. Now, last but very much not least, Nora Al-Badri. It's a big pleasure to hear her thoughts from the perspective of an actual practicing artist. She's a conceptual media artist, self-taught. She just told me she's got a background as a political scientist. Maybe we can dig into that as well. What made her go into the arts finally? She's got quite a name when it comes to media arts. Some of you might know her most famous work, which was the Nofretete hack. She's also got a German-Iraqi background, which maybe adds to her interest in kind of decolonizing AI and technology. Right? Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all for coming here despite the sun outside. Very much appreciated. So let me see how that might work. That's supposed to be a video. That's okay. Maybe today I'll only show you one of my recent pieces because we have a very limited amount of time, I think. But before I start with this work, a few sentences about why I work with AI or what my grounds, like basic assumptions are, basically why I was interested in engaging with technology and art, probably a bit more broader, because it's not just AI, it's very different, various technologies, and I think they all have various similarities, as we will maybe discuss later on. I think what is very important, we have seen like many critical positions of artists that dealt with AI, and I think that's what we all try to achieve, but I would like to add one other perspective from an artist to this, is because what I find very interesting and as well challenging is to add kind of the opening up of new imaginaries and perspectives through art and to open, for example, in a field that is highly contested like AI and that is highly critical in many ways, also a post-colonial way. I still see a lot of potential for emancipatory practices and projects and even subvert many of those very harmful mechanisms. Maybe, yeah, we'll also talk about the things, and you've probably heard about all those problems of biases in AI a lot in the past years. But there's also many ways how to actually tackle that and how to subvert it and use it for something very emancipatory. And this is what I'm trying to do with my work. But of course, and I think the digital and AI it's just another artistic and social practice that is very important these days because we live in a post-digital world. We also live in a post-colonial world, and this is my perspective from which I'm looking at the technology. And maybe, yeah, so far, and it's very difficult not to lean into the narratives also of the techno fixes and techno solutionism that, oh yes, we have a problem in the world, we can solve it with technology, but also not to lean into the super dystopian narrative. Those are the two extremes I think I don't like personally, and I don't think they are helping anyone, basically. But so how can an emancipatory and decolonial art project look like? So I brought a recent one. It's called Babylonian Vision and Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture Series. It's actually based on the technology that is called generative adversarial networks. Usually I take a bit more time to describe it because it's important to understand also the conceptual aspect of the piece, to understand a little bit about the technology itself. What is happening here basically is you train a neural network that can either be already pre-trained by been seeing millions of images of the world or not, with your own data set, and then it generates new images. And I think it's a very fascinating new tool for artists. Like it's basically, I like to describe it to a camera, and many of my fellow artist colleagues are saying also it's a new paradigm for image making, because what comes out of those trainings, and let's see if that works at least. No, it doesn't work. That's so sad. I don't know. Anyone has an idea how I can actually start videos here? No. Maybe we can fix it, but what happens is it generates new images, and now we have seen this a lot even during these horrible times in Russia, where many deepfake portraits of people were generated exactly the same way. So you train the machine on millions of images of real people, and what it spits out is synthetic images. That is the word for it. And that is not just a mashup of what it has seen, but it is actually the machine then understands, okay, a face has 2 eyes, 2 ears, a nose, and then it starts to creating from scratch. And this latent space that was mentioned earlier is the space what I'm also interested in, because the machine basically can see billions of images at the same time, which we can't as humans. And yes, okay, this is perfect. Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, this is how actually the machine sees one object. And yeah, maybe I'll just dive briefly into this. In my practice, I work a lot with what I call cultural big data, and that's also, I think, relevant when you think about AI. We think always about innovation and future, but I think it's a very past-oriented technology, actually, because we train it always with data sets from the past. So this work, Babylonian Vision, I used a data set from Mesopotamian artifacts from the 5 biggest collections in the world that is objects like this, from Mesopotamia, from the area that is today's Iraq. So this is one of my very few more autobiographical projects, I think. Let me see if I have still, for a moment. And then I scraped basically those 5 global North museums because I asked them for the data sets, but just one of them, the Metropolitan Museum in the US, has it on an open API, so you can just download them, the images of the objects, and the others couldn't really deliver because they don't want to, because they have a copyright on the images. And this is a big topic of mine, is on repair and restitution also of those collections, and of course about the discourse of restitution and identity and misrepresentation of the Global South in our museums, and about those highly contested collections, basically. So then the other museums either didn't want to give it to me, or they couldn't, because it's not just 2 images, but thousands I needed for this project. So what I ended up with, I helped with 2 machine learning researchers, Nega Fodutan and Milika Bejati. Together we scraped the data, databases from the museums without their knowledge, basically, and then trained the AI. And I'll come back to this in a moment, why this is important. It's not, it's a kind of a hack again, but a different one. So what happens then in the machine, this is the process where the machine actually learns how the data set looks like. That's the process of training and learning. It's a repetition that is going on. The generative is the discriminator, it's called. And here you can still see the remnants of the museum, basically, the palettes, the colorful, but those we actually put away from the data sets to kind of clean it. And it was a very challenging data set even for the researchers, because it's called diverse. It had in it textiles, jewelry, statues, broken pieces, a lot of pots, and but mostly broken pieces. And this is the images that comes out of it. And there's a big question, of course, I know it's, I don't know, I'm kind of convinced that this is a paradigm it's a very great new tool for artists that challenges also our notions of authenticity and authorship, and the question of, I think, originality of an artist. And I called one part of the series Neuronal Ancestral Sculpture Series, because basically all we do as artists is also going back to our personal past, consciously or unconsciously, or what has been in the world before, and then create something based on that. Because a lot of times people ask, of course, what is really new from these images, if it's only trained. But it's not just a mashup, and as an artist you have several artistic choices in collaborating with the AI. Actually, it starts with beginning to choose what kind of data sets you use for it, for example. And then there are very different, like in a camera, settings that you can basically change and go through the latent space and look for what you are imagining, how this kind of Bildsprache, the visual language of an era in that case, the Mesopotamian era, actually looks like. And this is then the vision aspect, where you can see the process of developing singular objects by the machine. And let me see if I forgot something important. Yeah, maybe one other aspect here is, I just touched it briefly in this project. is that Roland also mentioned in the beginning, we have a problem in the technology sector and in AI. This is how an installation, for example, of this work can look like. That not just that we have this brain question, but also the question of like what are the data sets or the neuronal networks we are exposed to as everyone basically trained by, and over 80% they are trained by visual data, but also text data that comes from the global north, but it's rolled out in the whole world. So when I talk about, for example, the visual data sets, we have a kind of visual hegemony again, and that does something with all of us, and I think it affects all of us. So this is also was also a means of creating actually a so-called southern data set that is based from like Iraq today, Mesopotamia that day, and especially for a country in that case that is so war-torn, where most of the artifacts are actually looted or outside of the country, to bring in a new narrative about a possible and more hopeful future. And the other important conceptual aspect was here actually the question of AI as a black box. It's a highly problematic thing. That means in many applications, you cannot really tell what was the input data or how the AI came to the results it does in the end. And this is highly problematic, for example, in medicine also. And it's something that is called now explainable AI, I think, like that tries to address that. And maybe we'll talk about this later. In the case of my project, this black box problem became actually something emancipatory because the Global North Museums, where I got those collections from, cannot prove that I actually used their data sets to create those artifacts. And maybe I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. So how long have you got? I think we could easily go on until 9 or so. We have to do that in about 40 minutes. We'll not be able to touch on everything we should. It's a huge topic. But let me just start with this kind of like I'm always kind of stunned by this attraction, this kind of mutual attraction when it comes to the artist side and the scientists or the data expert sides. Looks like something brings them together. And let me just go back to what I said before to kind of reflect on why this is special. Because let's go back to the engineers in the 19th century, the guys who, it was guys only, who constructed all the tunnels and made river corrections and all of that. Like, they didn't need the arts. And like, could you imagine an artist who was like, wow, I need to talk to the tunnel engineer. This is so fascinating. I want to work with kind of tunnel engineering stuff as well. That would help with my artistic practice. Like, it was all, obviously, it was a different time in the arts as well. But maybe we could quickly delve into this. Why do we feel kind of a closeness and these, why are these practices coming together? What makes it so attractive from your side, Alex?
Yeah, from my side, I mean, I see that there's interest, like I mentioned it in the story from the AI Center, that there's a fragmented landscape today. So that's something that drives me and say like, okay, if these are independent, what could we do by bringing them together? And I think at the collision point of the different things, this is what I would like to see. So I think it's completely fine that it's happening in several places, but that's for me what makes it interesting. The potential of bringing something that was maybe more separate together and creating something new.
So the artist as kind of an expert in kind of catalyzing different things and making connections, like unusual connections maybe.
Exactly.
Sabine.
But as I mentioned in my talk, I mean, there always has been an interest of art in the field of science. You know, when you look at the futurists that I mentioned and so forth, I think now with AI, it's on the one hand side, AI as a tool to use, but on the other hand, the necessity to really delve into what that means as artists a British artist said, it's a question that we cannot leave to the technologists. It's kind of questions that we as a society have to tackle. And that's why we have to engage with it. James Bridle, yeah, that's the name, yeah.
Nora?
Yeah, from my highly subjective, of course, and personal experience, I mean, I think there are many artists that are definitely not interested in technology, and that's totally fine. They have a very analog practice as well, right? So it's also a special kind of artist. But I think what I find personally so interesting is actually our projections from the society onto technology and the other way around. And of course, that is so pervasive that it's everywhere, and it's the impact on society so large. And that post-digital time, this is just where we are now. So I think it's actually a very daily tool, or it will become, as Sabine also said, in every exhibition you'll find now AI-based tools, artworks that speak about it. And AI especially I think is so interesting because conceptually, how we can also see it, I think, is it has kind of this collective knowledge sometimes, or even a collective agency in the worst and best case scenario. The racism is the worst part, but in the best part, it can show us patterns as a society that we haven't even thought about before, for example. And I think those aspects are also like very interesting speculative material for every artist.
And aren't you kind of helping the mystification of this kind of simple technology, right? I remember Jürgen Schmidhuber once said, you know, AI, it's a famous colleague of yours, responsible for deep learning, a big name, and he kind of said, you know, AI is actually really simple. Like, there's no big deal. It's just mathematics. So we keep on discussing this. Is there a real intelligence in there? Is it the right term? Right? Isn't it just? Or another great guy I love reading, Bruce Schneier. He once said, it's kind of a running gag. Amongst data scientists, as long as it doesn't work, it's artificial intelligence, and once it starts working, it becomes statistics. So it kind of loses this big mythical quality of, wow, there's something really, really amazing happening in the machine, and the black box you mentioned is also something that adds to that, right? The black,
yeah,
it's fascinating. It's just we don't actually understand what it's happening. So shouldn't we just maybe stop a bit and say, well, it's actually just statistics. There's nothing really crazy happening here, and we need to talk about this differently, and that would hold for the artists as well. You're kind of helping the whole PR machinery, right?
Yeah, it depends on the artwork, I would say. In the best case, also the artwork is exactly demystifying, I think, and critically asking, and there are many great artworks that are actually doing this or using it for their own purpose. And I think every good artist is exactly trying to do that as well, because there is no magic, of course, involved. But if you have a magical moment that then is constantly unwrapping, for example, another work of mine, I had a chatbot where in the beginning the people were so amazed, like what deep conversations this chatbot could actually be having a few years ago. There it was even more new. But then after a while they figured that's actually like all human made. It's super scripted, and just by like a small reaction we feel we have this illusion. This is the word, I think. And I think the demystification is a very important part. And also what I wanted to say today, what I brought with me, I forgot it, the statistics now, but that's usually, and every AI researcher is, I think, super aware of it, is that an AI is not an autonomous machine at all. Like, most of the things are actually human-based, and there is, of course, a big narrative about that is the PR machine that doesn't want us to see it. It's called, for example, the ghost labor. There's even a word for it. And this happens mostly in the global south, by the way, that actually makes that whole thing running and possible. And I think the audience or the general public is not enough aware of it, but I know the researchers are, and we as artists are too. But yeah, I think we should talk about this more.
Yeah, I would like just to add to that. I mean, I showed this work by Justine Aymar, the robot interacting with the dancer, and what you saw on the side, there was not so much time to talk about it, was actually the data reveal, what the machine sees, to help us understand that it doesn't see its data processing, its zeros and ones. Yeah. So it's very much about demystifying what is happening. Or also the example of Lauren Lee McCarthy and Kyle McDonald with the facial recognition based on the 6 key emotions and all the failures. Of course, the work, we presented the exhibition in 2020. We were all wearing masks and the system was completely lost, of course, to detecting anything. But for the artists, that was also kind of failure as a potential to showcase what they really wanted to talk about in the piece, to demystify and to also make us understand the challenges of what these systems are doing. And we are allowing them in so many processes, like for example, change judgments for job interviews and so on. Should we do that, right?
Yeah, we definitely have to talk about this as well. But I just want to hand this over to Alex quickly, because you said we're kind of early on. So are you okay with this idea of demystifying it? Or would you actually say, well, we'll be mystifying it a lot more, because there's so much still to be seen, right? We're just seeing the tiny beginnings of something that is going to feel much more magical and much more kind of black boxy, and the machine will be able to do things that we can't even imagine now. Or where is it going?
So I think that the machines will take over the world and so on. That's a little bit too mystical. But I think what is interesting, what you said is, should we do that? Do we want that? And what I see is basically that there's a lot that people don't understand yet. For instance, you see it in some businesses that they have some process, they feel adding AI will solve everything. But if you look at the past, technology is mostly an amplifier. So if you have a bad process that is very biased, you're putting AI on it, guess what? It does not fix your bias problem, it amplifies it, right? So these are kind of things where people are then suddenly surprised that, if it's trained with the practices and the data that you have done, that this is kind of like boosting it on a negative. And that demystification, I would like to drive the people understand, it's not a magical thing that will heal and improve anything. You need to learn how to use this as a tool effectively, right? I think that's quite a key thing that I would like to demystify.
And I would like to add effectively and fairly, right? And like ethically. That's really important, right? Because if you're just going for the effectiveness, maybe you just forget about the whole negative sides you're taking with you.
But just to add on that side, I mean, like somehow in the last 10 years we created this image that we just need more data and everything else will go away, right? But we are now at a scale where we're training models where the training costs $10 million, right, for text-based models. So it's only accessible to a few companies in the world, and basically still, we have this mindset we just need more and more data. But now we see that suddenly we're at a peak. Autonomous driving, it's postponed for a while, and many people don't realize that what's happening right now is that basically people waking up and wondering why is this happening, because why can't we just add more data and then we're done? So this is why I think like we need more tools, and these tools, for instance, include that we see what did the models actually learn, what is in there, and I think that's a different approach from the last 10 years where it was a lot about very brute force. A lot of data, a lot of compute, and then hopefully does something, right? Now the next 10 years, I think a lot more adaptive, a lot more continuous. And so my concern is that if we judge now from the past 10 years and ask the question, maybe we'll ask the wrong ones, because the past, like Nora mentioned it, the systems today, they stop learning typically after you deploy them. So any bias, even if it's a small one, will still stay in there. Imagine you had a system that continues to learn. This becomes a lot less critical, right? And also the injustice of like high data collected on these parts. At the moment, it amplifies it, and this is what I think what is still early, and where I would turn it around and not say should we do it? But how can we change it that we get out of this?
So we're now between the four of us. We're using a term very normally, which I would like to know if this is kind of already part of common sense when it comes to AI. We're talking about bias. Who's aware of bias? Yeah, maybe let me. Okay, so this isn't kind of a special choice, I guess, of people out there. For me, bias is really an important topic, and I think I've learned about bias in AI through artworks. So that would be, for me, a very important. Maybe let's quickly talk about the potential role of the artist when it comes to these technologies, right? Is it about informing a general public about the danger as well of AI, or is it just about making things more explainable? What exactly can artists do? And it's a complex field, right? I'm constantly overwhelmed with what AI is. So how can you?
I mean, what you're picturing is, I would say, more the role of the educator in general. And I think that's also happening. I think it's a discourse, at least, that is a bit more rolled out in the past years than it was before. It certainly can be one of the roles artists choose to have, I'd say. And I'm also interested in it, for sure. And this is why I create Southern data sets. This is also part of this decolonial or decolonizing technology practice as art practice. And others are doing this even more obvious, like in the cases where they are making it obvious that that you'll encounter biases. But yeah, so it can be a byproduct. It can be the main goal of artists. It's certainly one of the roles artists have, I'd say. But I think, again, a little bit, when we talk about machines, we talk about human in a way. And this is sometimes something that doesn't come together because it's either the machinic number abstraction, which is true, like the machine only sees numbers, but the machine is looking at things and at numbers that we are teaching it. And I think this aspect sometimes is not loud enough. And I think this is also the most relevant aspect for artists. It's not the machine, it's the human input in a way and the impact of the machine on society.
Yeah, I would say there are many examples of artists tackling exactly that question of bias. For example, American artist Trevor Paglen, who is really showcasing the databases where the training data comes from and making us aware how limited some of these databases are. Or another artist who really read in his video installation, so it's not AI based, but it's about AI. So he's retelling the story of the chatbot Tay that was released by Twitter. I don't remember, I think in 2016, and it was online for 24 hours only, and then they had to take it offline because it turned into a racist Nazi, basically. Because it was interacting with humans, unfiltered. And that also showcased, how dangerous it is or how naive one could be to just put things out there. And a positive example would be the musician Holly Herndon that I mentioned. She trained her AI, which she calls Spawn, and on her own voice, to become this member of her ensemble, but it was she was first only her interacting with it, then the ensemble, and then with the audience. And she kind of showcased in her work how sensitive one has to be with that systems and how you make them learn and with whom you make them interact.
So I'll be opening this in a minute, but let's just. I'll have to ask you another one. We're talking about this critical role of the artist a lot here, which is obviously my take on this as well. But this is not what I see out there when it comes to fellowship programs. Nora, you mentioned in our pre-discussion that you actually turned down a proposal to work with some AI art initiative from Facebook.
Yes.
The most famous ones are with Google. All kinds of companies go with this kind of let's infuse the technology with artistic inputs. Alex, seriously, like you're not looking for watchdogs criticizing your work, right? You're inviting in artists because you want them to help innovate, to open up, maybe to bring in their creative potential. Do you really want to invite in artists who go like, no, listen, guys, you're not thinking enough about bias here. Like you need to go back and learn, right? You don't have time for this, do you?
Well, I think like one thing that is very important to step up, to make us step back is basically, I think amazing things happen if people go outside of their comfort zone. And for sure, we're not just putting the people on the science side, but also on the artist side, a little bit out of the comfort zone. And what I mean by that is basically that I believe that the intersection is the part, because, you know, if you have so much energy that you bring in, that you express yourself, you drive, why can't we take this energy and actually use that to change hearts and minds, right? So this is for me the outcome that I ultimately want to achieve, and so I think it's not stopping there. I think it's the opposite. Like look at the last 20 years, many of the key technologies that are influencing many global things, social networks, smartphones, they have not been very actively shaped. We were more or less like a little bit overwhelmed, and now after 20 years we see, oh, maybe, you know, there's some negative effects on elections, on crisis, and so on. So we're catching up, right? And I think this is now at the point where we are today, that we have learned from the last 20 years what happened in that part, and we can use that now for something constructive. And to construct something, you need to dissect it, you need to talk, you need many things. Like it's not a simple, like Nora said it beautifully, there's a spectrum, right? So it's not just that technology solves everything, we know that, right? And also not the dystopian one. We said, oh, we need to stop using all electricity, no more computers, no more phones whatsoever. So we need to find a middle ground, and it's not easy, and it will collide, but I think in a positive way.
Mm. May I add something from my perspective? Because, it's a funny question, but I'd say the problem, for example, that are dealing with the bias and racial discrimination, I don't see that as a problem actually at ETH, as the researchers are very aware of it. I think you brought it up, Facebook or companies are a much bigger threat in a way, because they look at it not from neither scientific nor artistic, of course, but from an economic perspective, and it doesn't make any sense for them to change the things so far because they don't have economic incentives, and this is the harmful part. And specifically, because you said it a bit nicely, Alex, that we have some problems in elections with social media. Specifically, for example, Facebook played a big role in a genocide in Myanmar and stuff like this. It's like very serious, and it's not regulated enough. And apparently, it's not well understood enough even by the employees of those companies, how harmful their actions actually are, or they just don't care. But the universities, at least, are a space of really like more the freedom and the reflection, where we actually there don't need to talk about the bias problem, but this is also a chance for artists to think about more other options, basically, and more emancipatory ways of using the tools that are in part super great.
I quite like that, because we might also just stop talking about technologies and say this is about spaces, social spaces, right? And spaces of conflict are obviously interesting for artists, have always been. So for me that makes total sense that artists go where it hurts, and maybe it's not about technology as such. Maybe we have some 20 minutes left. Let's open it up. Let's have some questions from the audience.
Please. Here's one.
Thank you very much. It has been fascinating. So my question is to Alex. So in the AI Center, I have written an article about AI, so I dived deep into it last year for ETH China. So one thing I'm aware of, AI, there are two layers. First, whatever we make, it's actually us. So it comes from us, so it's a mirror of us. Second, whatever we make, it will shape us. It's a living thing, it's not just a machine. So we live in a society, science, technology has advanced a lot, but not really wisdom. So I think the danger is if these two gap is too big, I don't know where we're heading to. So my question is, in the center, do you have thinkers or philosophers who is, what you mentioned about the example is a detail, but in a larger picture, do you have some thinkers you work with, making sure we are not making something?
Yeah. So how do we make sure basically we're doing something good, that we, kind of...
It's just that you mentioned you had a picture of AlphaGo.
Yeah.
I watched this movie twice.
Yeah.
So there's one moment
Yeah.
when because he didn't have a real person.
Yeah.
So you realize actually he is losing because himself. He's losing to himself. So it reviews our relationship with AI. So I just think we need more wisdom while we are making technology. We need wisdom to guide this technology, to form this, to guide, because it can go really.
Yeah.
Can I just quickly, for the ones who don't know about that moment you were referring to, that's the Go game that Lee Sedol, the current world champion, lost to AlphaGo some 5 years ago. And there's a really beautiful scene in that documentary, which is I think online to be seen, where you realize that, or where he's actually realizing that AlphaGo is way more powerful than he thought, and he's going to be losing against the machine, which was unthinkable before. Like the game of Go was always considered as the thing that AI will not master within the next, 40, 50 years. So he might have actually lost himself because he was so shocked that this was right. Or I don't know how you feel like he lost himself, but somehow this is all about we're having an encounter with ourselves when we encounter AI. But anyway, the question was for you.
Yeah, so I think there are really, emotional and really strong things in the movies, in these competitions. But just one thing to highlight also, like for instance, if you're playing chess against a machine, if you just say, let's add one more row to the chess field, the whole system does not work anymore. So for a human, you can adapt, right? So that's also, why the limitation should be clear. And of course, sometimes I have the feeling like this is really amplified too much, that it's something that works independently. That's why I say, for me, I see it as a tool, right? And it can do something and accelerate this. And this, when this becomes completely independent from human, that's for me more on the dystopian side, which is very, very far out. We're now at this level where it can be used for something specific.
We are two in a larger.
If we are, sorry?
We are actually two in a matrix. We are actually two, so we would say.
I would say that's okay if we're happy.
No. But I think. Sorry, yeah.
No, I was just saying, like there is a lot of elements there that where humans are far better, and I would say, like, I would not always like this, even if you go to this approach and say that you believe that you're unfailable, is not a good approach to walk into a situation anyway. But I would say, let's rephrase the question and see, what are things that we actually like to do and where and we enjoy doing? Because there are tons of things in our lives where we're wasting a lot of valuable time coordinating meetings, driving from A to B. So there are many, many things. Like if you enjoy driving, it's another story. But I think we should think of it this way, that we say, okay, if this should make our life easier, then we should focus on this and not like always try to say the only purpose of AI is to replace humans. I think that's not the goal. That's a different discussion. But it's of course nice because then you can go in a very controversial point. But I think the other way is much stronger. How can this be in combination that it's actually helping us?
But it's like let me just add on to this. Like it might be helping, but it might also not. You don't really know. And I think that's a weak point up to now, that it's actually the engineers between them who are developing this. So my question would be, are you thinking about involving non-engineers into the development teams? And not kind of an ethicist who's then, once it starts working, then maybe making some reflections, but right at the start, social scientists, ethicists, maybe even artists in the developmental teams, right? Who are actually working on these, I'd say, not only tools, but actually, like, yeah, this is much more than just a technical tool.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think like that you have a team set up that is very complementary, interdisciplinary, and so on is very important. I mean, so this is also why we bring a number of different disciplines, different people together, not just one part. But one thing that I would like to mention also. A wrong approach would also be if you say, okay, let's appoint now an ethics officer for AI and the problem is solved. Because this would be way too detached for me. So because we want this learning, and I have a feeling that, we have a very strong ethical code here and many other parts where we already live by, right? So, but still, and for every machine learning conference, you need to submit now an ethics statement. But I would argue that it's become more like something automated in a checklist instead of like changing something in your behavior. And the behavior change, you have to learn it. And this is something where we need a few people, where this collision happens more or less inside them and not just adding another person next to them. Yes, it's good to have the teams, but I would be careful that now companies go and they have like a chief AI ethics officer that's supposed to fix everything.
And maybe what we're also actively doing, for example, through this bachelor seminar, starting young, really questioning, like what you said in the very beginning, power structures on what those technologies are actually based on, and showing alternative examples, for example, of indigenous AI and very different approaches that are not so much discussed already early on. I think this is also one contribution the AI Center did here in that educational stage.
Great. More questions? Wow. I told you, we're going to sit in here for hours.
Thank you very much. I had a question about intellectual property, because AI and art, I think, can open something that could be quite complicated. Nora, you mentioned, not being able to access all the original images you were after. You went to one museum, you got what you needed, but you probably dreamed for more and were not given that. At the same time, you're an author and a creator yourself, so you have to protect your own creation. How do all of you on the panel see this evolving? How will we go? Will everything become an open system? Will you as an artist lose your copyright? And where will we be in 10 years in this area?
Let's have another panel, but huge topic. I'm curious to hear your opinion on that.
The artists that I worked with all see it quite clearly that AI for them is a collaborator. It's a complex tool, but so the copyright issue is not really there yet. And I was also participating, I think 2 years ago, in a conference that was on AI and law. And also from the lawyer side, there, at the moment at least, they say there is no need for action right now.
Yeah, maybe what is more relevant in the copyright question is the Persönlichkeitsrechte, I don't know, the individual right of your picture, for example. This is something that is happening now, that debate, and I know there is some new lawmaking about it. But the authorship question, I agree, is usually it's similar to the lawmaking regarding remixes. The music always got remixed, so now we have AI that does some form of remixing, or there are a few other words about it, not collages, but basically that it's new images that come out of it that are that have a personal touch. So even if someone would remix my works, actually that was something what I also did with the Nefertiti hack, that was to make the data set open for everyone. And it got remixed, and this was part of an artwork as well. And it's actually an honor, I think, to be cited and stuff like this. So far, I don't see it problematic. It's more on the personal level, I think, when people don't know that they are surveilled or that their data for Flickr, I remember, was a big debate. Once everyone who had uploaded their personal pictures, that went into training data sets without asking the people. And maybe one other thing, because I'm now working on a deepfake project with a few researchers from the AI Center and from ETH, and also it's not really true that the artists or the outsider or the human from the humanities are the more like asking themselves ethical questions, I would say. On the contrary, I think actually in the moment engineers maybe even too much censoring what they are doing, because for every conference, for every paper, they have to ask the question if everything is safe to use the data sets. And me as an artist, when I see that, it's a bit limiting also to ask exactly the questions we need to ask. We need to go to the places where it actually hurts and where the boundaries are, of course, without violating someone's rights, but still challenging it, I'd say. Oh, yeah. Maybe we can collect the questions also.
Maybe
get numbers.
Thank you. This is all very interesting. I have a question about the title of this event. It's AI and art. And if AI is a tool, as one of you mentioned, I wonder if it would be conceivable ever to have an event called Paintbrush Manufacturing and Art. What I mean by that is there must be some kind of power relationship between the two elements of the title that are tied somehow to the novelty of AI. So my question is, what happens once AI becomes normal, and it is no longer, it becomes normal like a paintbrush or like oil painting or something like that. What happens then? What happens to art? What happens to AI? And at the moment, is AI, the technology, maybe somehow more profiting from this relationship as it is presented here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we are still in this hype cycle. That's why there's a lot of talk about art and AI. But I think for artists, it is already a very well-known and used tool in art schools. For example, at ECHAL, they teach AI since a couple of years. So I think it's already both. Part of the palette. It's both, yeah.
And I think the benefit is mutually in some cases, what you're talking about. But I think maybe it's important to talk about the role of the art in the AI Center, because when we say AI and art, we don't mean necessarily the technology AI, but the concepts that are behind it and the questions that come with it. We could have put it in the title, but then it would be probably too long. But it's really more also about the concept of AI. What does it mean for not just the engineers, but why are we discussing it?
Can I maybe add a question concerning this to Alex? Because there's different fields that are interesting to play around for AI scientists, right? And looks like the arts is one of them, but there's other ones. It's not the only one. Like it's not a kind of exceptional connection here. We could also have a panel about gaming and AI, right?
Yeah.
So maybe you can give us a bit of an insight into which fields are actually interesting for data scientists to play around with. Why is making images such fun?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that you see maybe in other places where it's more strongly established that you actually have like a cycle, you know, from art, design, engineering, and science, you know, helping each other, learn from each other. And I think we have not practiced that in a very strong way. And I see a lot of potential in this combination. And I think the questions are highly relevant that are brought in. So yes, I mean, that artists are using AI, that is, let's say, something normal as using AI in other parts. It will bring a number of transformative things. It already started, but basically that's what Nora mentioned, that AI is a concept and working on this part together. This is the interesting part, because through art and science, from the AI perspective, we basically touch the society, and this is kind of for me the novelty in this part. And as I mentioned, I think we missed this a little bit for technologies that came up in the last 20 years. And now we learned, now we can apply it, and AI is now the next one. So I could also see that 20 years maybe that's all commodity, and we have shaped it in a good way that, you know, we also don't need an AI center anymore, because people understand. It's not about programming lines of codes, but it's basically the way of thinking that is behind, the way that works to understand this part. But this is why I think it's an opportunity that we have now, and we want to take it.
So maybe 2 more questions, 3 more. Oh, I see so many hands. Yeah, please.
I have the mic. So I guess the thing is that we have seen, you know, new technologies coming into the art, you know, sphere, and people adopting to it.
Working.
It's working, right?
That's working.
Sorry.
So we have seen other technologies coming in, and photography, you know, film has also changed art. And I guess my thing is that, you know, there was always at the beginning a criticism and a skepticism, and things have basically adopted, and people learned how to do things with it. So I guess my question is, we have right now a lot of the emphasis of the artworks is to understand the boundaries and have a critical view. But I guess, Sabine, for you, have you also seen certain artists who actually think about this? You know, I'm a digital native and these are the possibilities, and the works are highlighting the possibilities rather than having a social critique.
Yeah.
I think there is both. You know, there is what I see, you know, from the field of media arts. Like in the 90s, it was really difficult to get hold on technology. You know, we had these computers that were as big as a room, so you needed facilities where you could work with these technologies, and you had someone like what we called then the media artist. Nowadays, I think there is no longer the traditional media artist, because what I see also with young students is that they take whatever is there, what they can use, and AI is kind of one of the tools they can use, and they may make a work with, you know, with AI, but then the next time they do a sculpture. So I think it's really broadened, that it's part of the potential of technologies that you can use to create art with. And yes, I personally see a lot of this critical reflection in artists to always kind of see what are the impacts of technology, be it kind of like the change of labor. It was mentioned before, you know, that a lot of so-called AI is fake, that it's actually a human somewhere behind the screens monitoring these things. But then, of course, there's also practices where it's really more kind of a la polar perspective, in the sense of creating new visual worlds or soundscapes.
Exactly. Sound and music, I think, is a good example for that, actually. There's, for example, the artist Casey Rias, or even Trevor Packham. They also did, I think, like a work about cinematography and AI, and that was not just systemically, critically, or inherently.
Maybe it's a question for Nora. I mean, you mentioned the word decolonization, and I was intrigued by this. And you mentioned Myanmar, and you mentioned the role of the artist from the global south. Maybe you could expand a little bit on that topic. I was, and help me to understand what decolonization in this context really means.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big topic. I can only touch it in a few sentences now here, of course, but I can try, for example, to start when we talk about any new technology, I think it's the same thing that the brain power, the most of them is in the global north, and the hidden labor, ghost work actually is the term for it, happens in the south, and not just that. Even the beta testing of our software happens in the south, and this has a long colonial history, and this is why this is a post-colonial topic that started when you think about, for example, the technology of fingerprinting that started in India in the colonies. And now, before we're rolling out in the global north or internationally, we test, unfortunately, on societies that are not even protected through any rights of their governments, for example, of their own like personal images or whatever it is, and who are maybe not. The term digital native, by the way, is very ridiculous because usually the native people of the world are the ones with the worst access to technology. So this is why I never use it. This is also some things where we need to think about and reflect also about our language or the technology, like AI ecosystem. Like what Alexander mentioned, AI is in the moment needs so much energy. It is the contrary. It's not an ecosystem. It's an anti-ecosystem in the moment. And we shouldn't mix all of that up. And I mean, of course, yeah, as I said, the databases, most of the AI systems are trained with, be it visual, textual, or whatever, with music, are mostly from the north, so this is also problematic. Although you could say sometimes it's really good not to be seen and not to be included, because things that might help us here in a country where we have a lot of rights in our society might be super harmful. The same software, I think, who is it actually, who is selling surveillance software to Ethiopia and to other regimes that are not, they just want to control their people with the same technology we might use here just for traffic lights or so. So this is a part of the problem, and I don't want to go too much into the thing with the role of the artist. I would say there's not the artist, right? So it's my personal field, what I'm interested in, because I think you cannot look at the world without recognizing the power structures, and I think you cannot make art without recognizing the power structures. So as an artist, for example, it's also important to think about where to exhibit your works. So what I always try to do as much as I can to premiere my works in the Global South, for example, and also to shift resources from here to there. This is what we can do through fellowships, for example, because, I mean, the media artists here, and I'm part of them as well, we have similar questions about the technology, but people who don't have the access yet to those tools, but they have the same skills, but who would be interested, I think, when we have more Southern artists engaging with that kind of high tech, let's say, and with the experts here, we might get very different artworks. And this is what I'm interested in, because we all have the same questions and they are important, of course, but it's just one perspective. And this is all like what one can do as an artist, as a decolonial practice, I think.
Maybe just quickly to add on this, we might have another intercultural perspective that can be interesting, because China is just becoming the biggest AI power, right?
Sure.
So quick question, is there a different take on AI and on critical or ethical AI when you talk with colleagues from China or artists from China, or do we see kind of the same take on things?
Let me think of artists from China. I think, like in general, what I've seen from the technology perspective, this is actually something that's called South-to-South colonization, because when China tries to roll out and deploy and sell their software to the global south first. So it's also a kind of a race in AI between mainly the US and China, who's first there because of the unused market and labor and everything. But in the arts, I think, which artist I can think of now? I'm actually quite sure that we have similar questions. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you know probably more.
I would say, without generalizing, that there's a bit more positive embracing of the technologies that I see, but there are also critical voices. I mean, artists that we have worked with from Korea, Xing Bak and Kim Jong-un, for example, do very poetic installations with AI. And even in China, I forgot the name right now, but someone who's really doing a critical monitoring of showcasing what is happening and the monitoring processes that are enabled through AI. But in general, I also met colleagues, and I have to admit that they are really more open to that social scoring, for example, that is going on in China. So there's not so highly critical debated the impact on our privacy.
And actually, there's one great example I can think of now. She's not an artist, but an investigative journalist from China. I forgot her name, but she wrote a beautiful book. It's called Blockchain Chicken Farm. And what she does is showing fantastic examples, like positive examples about AI, how AI is rolled out in the rural China, and criticizing this, it's called metronormativity, that when we talk about AI, usually we think about the metropolitan urban regions, what it does here, and she shows the potential, what is already happening in rural China. So there are certainly some other, maybe more even, positive examples.
Okay, I think we need to. We're going with this. No, the last question is, no, sorry. I wanted to add that, but just wanted to say sorry already to everybody else who had a question, but we're taking that as the last one for sure.
Okay, well, I'm very privileged to ask the last question here. I think it's a question for Sabine, but it could be a question for anybody. In most of the applications of AI, you know what the objectives are. You know what you're trying to do. If you've got autonomous driving, you want to get from A to B safely. But in art, you don't quite know what you're trying to do. You're looking for creativity. And, what can AI help us to learn about creativity or about visual appeal? So, artists have always sought to find rules for visual appeal from the golden mean. Now we have this great mass of data to try and work out what visual appeal is. What can AI do to help us answer the specific aesthetic questions in art?
Sorry, I love that question because I have to add quickly that I actually did a workshop with writers. We talked about reinforcement learning, and it was exactly that question, right? With reinforcement learning, if you have a game like Go, you can talk about the winning strategy. And so we kind of ended up with this. That was my question to the artist. What's your winning strategy, right? Could you actually define this very easily? Because if you can teach that to the machine, and the machine can learn that winning strategy. But well, do we have that as artists? That's a beautiful one. That's a great last question.
No, it is a great question and not easy to answer. I think that a lot of artists are interested to use AI to be surprised. That what Mario Klingemann is always saying, that he wants, in his perspective as an artist, he wants to be positively surprised by the outcomes. And I think it's exactly what he's so great with, that he finds this moment where he is dipping into that latent space of the computational image production, where it's neither nor. So it becomes a human face, but then it changes into something else immediately. And that's, for us, very uncanny, but also kind of very fascinating. And something that I find also interesting is, and an example by Jenna Sutela, who actually had a residency with Google Arts and Culture. And she made an AI learn glossolalia, kind of speaking a language that does not exist. And I think that's also interesting that artists come up with these crazy ideas to do something that is not yet there. Because we heard a lot of that AI is kind of reproducing Bach, for example, is kind of reproducing what we already have. But, you know, an artist can come up with that crazy idea to have an AI do glossolalia. And I think that was also inspiring then, because it's a two-way situation that was certainly also inspiring for Google. And that's why they are doing these artist residencies, I'm sure.
Anybody else wants to react to that?
Yeah, just maybe very shortly. I think what the artists can do here is do some data fiction and not datafication, not just reproduce what was there. And we will certainly see, and we are already seeing this new aesthetics in the media arts. From what was there in the beginning, where you thought of, I don't know, where it was more about hardware probably, and now we see the aesthetics of the software, and it's just happening now. And this is, I think, what is also fascinating for me personally, but also for some fellow artists, that we can experiment and explore without trying to solve a problem or anything.
Great. Alex, urgent ones?
So,
yeah.
Apparently it's me, so sorry from that side. So nothing to add to that topic, but like if we're just wrapping up, one thing that is really important, like it's an invitation. That's why we're here. That's why we created today. So even if you didn't get the chance to ask a question, so you can reach us. We're also sticking around a little bit here, and we really be grateful for feedback and opportunities to work together. We're also doing many things that seemingly not scale. For instance, we visit now several small communities in Switzerland to talk about, what we do, bring researchers and so on, because we feel it's a field where people don't know actually, like it's very mystical, and I think it doesn't have to be. I think there's a lot to be shared and learned, and that can be helpful quite a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you for bearing with us. We could have gone on and on and on. Whoever wants to, I think there's drinks. We're around, terrace is open. Please stay a bit and please come back. I hope there's going to be more discussions like that. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you.